So first of all, just to say again, welcome everyone. Thank you so much to everyone who's joining us today for the latest in the Dublin Cycling Campaign monthly public meetings via Zoom. And this is our fourth virtual public meeting in 2021. So hopefully, we were chatting a little bit earlier, hopefully we'll get to have our in-person meetings soon enough. But for now, we're continuing with the virtual format. So thanks everybody for setting aside some time in your day to join us, and especially to our panelists for coming along to join us and give us their time and their expertise and knowledge. My name is Joan O'Connell. I'm a member of Dublin Cycling Campaign's Executive Committee. And separately, I'm also a volunteer as a marshal with the Dublin H School Cycle Bus. So a little plug for them. And I'm also a co-founder and an organizer of Monthly Cycles, which is an initiative in Dublin which provides social cycles for women in Dublin. So it's meant to be inclusive, all ages and abilities are welcome. So again, it's kind of very much on the theme of having inclusive cycling and inclusive mobility in the city. Before we turn to the topic of the meeting today, I do want to first of all acknowledge on behalf of the Dublin Cycling Campaign the passing of Paddy Cahill. I do want to pass on our sincere condolences to his family and his loved ones, and in particular to our friend and colleague Conor, who is Paddy's brother. So may Paddy rest in peace. It was quite shocking and sad news that we heard recently. So we do have a link to the obituary for Paddy that'll be placed into the chat box. So people may wish to click on that and read that at their leisure. So our sincere sympathies to his family and everybody who knew Paddy. That was quite terribly sad news. So moving on back to today's discussion, just afterwards, you know, if people want to hang around, normally we would, in the in-person meetings, we'd have, you know, some chats afterwards, maybe hang around for a coffee or a drink or something like that. So on the virtual side of things, we will ask if people want to stick around for a chat. We can change the settings so that people can come in and chat in person if they wish to do that. So you can join in all the chin wagging afterwards. So today's meeting, we'll move on to that. Basically, as everybody knows, it's on the theme of how can cycling enable mobility and independence. So Dublin Cycling Campaign's vision and our mission and our aims is to have a vibrant, livable city, a city in Dublin for people, where everybody can safely enjoy everyday walking and cycling. It really shouldn't be something that's a difficulty or a problem or a danger even. So we do advocate for cycling infrastructure that's accessible to people of all ages and all abilities. So during today's meeting, we'll explore what cycling options and opportunities there are for people with disabilities or disabled people. So that is cycling as a form of everyday transport. Also cycling that might be used as a mobility aid or as a help to get some physical and mental well-being into people's day-to-day lives. So today we're hearing from a panel of experts about their personal experiences of cycling, their research and their campaigning, and the barriers that cyclists with disabilities can face as they try to get around, or as we were talking about earlier on, disabled cyclists, because we're talking about people who are disabled by that lack of infrastructure or by the problematic infrastructure that people face as they're trying to cycle. So today's speakers are Mary Caulfield, who is journalist and disability activist and also a fellow member of the Dublin Cycling Campaign's Executive Committee. We also have Isabelle Clement, Director of Wheels for Wellbeing, and also who is a hand cycler. Dr. Owen Clifford, who's a senior lecturer, civil engineering in NUI Galway and a 4-time paracycling world champion. So I feel like I'm a huge underachiever here. We also have Ellis Palmer, a news journalist and producer, and who is also a hand cycler. So the event, as I said, I'll be chairing the event. My name again is Joan O'Connell, and I just want to give a quick and very important thanks to Mairead Forsyth and Siobhan McNamara, also of Dublin Cycling Campaign, who organised today's meeting. So Siobhan is acting as our host for today, so she'll be sharing her screen, and then panellists can ask her to skip through their presentation slides as you need. Just in terms of a brief word about housekeeping and the running order. So we'll go through each of the presentations in turn for about 8 minutes each. I'll try to give a reminder to everybody with 2 minutes to go. And then in turn, we'll go through the presentations, and at the end of all the presentations, we'll take some Q&A at that point. As we go through the presentations, however, Please do feel free to our participants and attendees here to use the Q&A function and the chat box function, which should appear at the bottom of your screens as you're watching. So at the end of the presentations, then we can go through some of those questions as well for our panelists. And so to cycling. As a brilliant campaign in the UK, Beyond the Bicycle makes clear, there's much more to cycling than your bog standard two-wheeled machine. So we have everything from hand cycles, upright tricycles, recumbent tricycles, wheelchair attachments, tandem bikes, wheelchair trailers that attach to the back of bikes. And we have electric versions of nearly all of those. And we also have e-bikes. And of course, there's the bog standard two-wheel bike, which some do use as a mobility aid, or just because they find cycling is easier than walking. So although not everybody can cycle, there is definitely a world of cycling options out there for many people, I think, with disabilities, and perhaps people who mightn't be aware of those possibilities or options that are available to them. So hopefully today we can provide some insights from the expertise and experiences of our panelists today. So to kick us off, to begin, we'll hear from Mary Caulfield. Mary, if you're happy to go ahead, I'll hand over to you, and then we can get your presentation slides going. Is that okay?
I'm happy to go ahead, but I'm supposed to be going last.
Oh, I do apologize.
Sorry, we actually have Isabelle lined up to go first, if that's all right, Joan. Thanks.
No worries at all. I mixed up my running order. Right, that's it. Perfect. Thank you so much, Isabelle, for starting us off. So if you're happy to talk about what it takes to make cycling inclusive, please feel free to go ahead.
Absolutely. Very happy to. Lovely to be with you this morning. Thank you for having me. Here you go. I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour of my recent experience over the last year. I've been, well, I'll tell you a bit more about myself in a minute. It is based in London, but I have very fond memories of being with you guys in lovely Dublin in 2018 for Velocity. So I hope the content should be applicable to Dublin. But let me tell you what it takes to make cycling inclusive from my personal perspective. So let's go to the first slide, please. Just very quickly, I'm the director of a disability and cycling charity down in London, and we're called Wheels for Wellbeing. We've been around since 2007, and we provide opportunities, literal physical opportunities for disabled people to try out cycling in South London, but we've also become nationally and internationally the voice of disabled people who cycle, or disabled cyclists. And we're led by disabled people who cycle as an organisation, and that's, I think, what makes us a bit different from others. Next slide, please. All right, this is me, a bit squished in the picture, and on a very cold day cycling around in London. Next slide, please. So very quickly, just my personal journey into becoming a hand cyclist. I've been disabled since the babyhood, so but not a cyclist since then. Well, when I was a toddler, my parents got me a rowing trike, so things were starting well, but it was very much like with most little children, just a bit of a toy, really. And then I grew out of that. I was very happy with it, but grew out of it. Didn't get to think about cycling again until until I was 10, and my parents, for some kind of big milestone, I can't remember what for, got me as a reward a bicycle, obviously thinking that I might be able to ride a bicycle. It didn't work. I couldn't balance, my feet wouldn't stay on the pedals, and that was cycling under the can't do category of things, and we moved on. So I learned in theory that at the age of 10, my parents and myself learned that I couldn't cycle. Next slide, please. Then in my mid-30s, I had my little boy was getting to his first little bike. That is not a picture of me, by the way, it's just stolen off the internet. My boy was getting his little first bicycle, and I was looking potentially at the prospect of not being able to take him to the park on my own anymore, because I wouldn't have been able to keep up with him in my wheelchair around the parks, around the paths of the park. So potentially you know, this was him going off and me being left behind. Next slide, please. Luckily, well, first of all, I thought, well, okay, I need to just bite the bullet and get myself a mobility scooter, because that's all I knew about the next thing in terms of more rough terrain, all-terrain mobility. I thought, you know, well, I didn't know about cycling, so but luckily I took some time over the research, and actually whilst I was researching to try and find the right mobility scooter, I came across the concept of clip-on hand cycles, as in turning your wheelchair into a cycle. And I went for that as a walking aid, not as a cycling aid at the time. Next slide, please. Well, then I became a complete cycling bore. I'm running Wheels for Wellbeing. I am Mrs. Disability and Cycling in theory, and this is in theory the picture that shows it. I am cycling the streets of London. I can't get more iconic than that. You've got a black cab chasing behind me, but actually I'm chasing ahead of him. Them. But actually this picture that I use a lot in a lot of presentations wasn't telling the whole story, because actually I wasn't actually cycling that much around the streets of London, though I was proving it was possible. Next slide, please. So until lockdown, I really only very much cycled from home to work, which really is not a great deal of miles. It's probably about 3 miles down the road. It is down the hill and it's back up the hill all the way. I could do that, and I did it a lot, but mostly, to be honest, when it was light, daylight, when it was not too cold and definitely not too wet. So I had a lot of learning to do in terms of building my confidence and learning about the practicalities of really making cycling a proper mode of transport for myself. So I was still using the car a lot. In lockdown, I became much keener to start using my hand cycle a lot more, because it was really the only physical activity I was going to be able to do. I wasn't even going to the office anymore. I didn't have a reason for being out there. The reason I hadn't been really cycling very much until then: traffic, too much of it. 3 wheels means the quality of the road surface, potholes, the camber were making me reluctant to go adventuring onto new roads. Wayfinding, finding a route that was a good route and didn't take me too far out of the way was quite time consuming. And also about cycling in the dark, I didn't really have much of a sense of how to get lights clipped onto my very funny shaped cycle. Next slide, please. So since lockdown, this map is probably not very useful, but it's showing something that I don't know if you are what the terminology is in Ireland, but we are talking a lot here, and it's very controversial, about low traffic neighbourhoods, which have been kind of basically just areas of residential streets where traffic has been reduced quite dramatically by blocking entrance or exits so everybody can get to their home by car, but they might not be able to go the quickest way. This is to discourage cars from clogging up residential streets. That's happened a lot in my borough, where I live in South London, and you can see all these purple areas, and there's an arrow which, if you can see it, is towards the bottom of the block of purple blobs, and that's where I live. I live really pretty much surrounded by low traffic neighbourhoods. And that's really been what started me cycling much more. Actually, it's made me feel a lot safer. And I have therefore started on a weekly basis every Sunday, going out with friends, cycling during lockdown and since. We call it Sunday Cycling Adventures. And I seem to be the person who's the most sort of gung-ho about finding new routes, and my friends aren't disabled people, but I'm leading the pack in a way, because I've just got a bit of knowledge about where the cycle routes are in London. And off we go. Next slide, please. So this is it really. This is just to show you, if you can see, this is not a very good or very high-tech slide, but anyway, I've drawn A and B in the center of the map. That was my cycle to work, my route, and pretty much, other than occasional times cycling with other people, that was the route that was the area I used to cycle in, from A to B, to and from work and home. in lockdown, I've put blobs, red blobs around all the areas that I have now explored with my friends on Sunday cycles, Sunday cycling adventures. The fact that cycling has traffic has been removed, traffic has been calmed in the whole of, many more areas of London, has given me, the disabled cyclist that I am and have been for a long time, actually the confidence to go much further, much wider afield, and that's because basically we have put cars out of our reach as cyclists. We have been protected from cars. It's been controversial. A lot of campaigns are trying to remove these low traffic neighborhoods. I'm very adamant personally that they are a very good thing, but as a disabled person, I also know that plenty of other people do not cycle, and that's because many barriers remain. I'm assuming I've run out of time. I can't see the clock on my computer, but I think if we go to the final slide, which is just my goodbye slide, I'm very happy to answer questions later on, but I'll probably run out of time now.
Thank you very much, Isabelle. No, you're bang on time, unless my timekeeping is wrong, so you're absolutely fine. Sorry about the lack of notice there, but yeah, you're well under, so I appreciate that. That's really brilliant, actually. It touches on some of the things that have cropped up in general discussions here in Dublin around lockdown and reallocating the public space for people for cycling and walking, the quality of the infrastructure. These are all topics that have come up here. I think the LTNs, the low traffic neighbourhoods, is not really something that's quite here in Dublin, certainly not in the same way or the same extent. But I do think that there's some comparisons. Maybe there's been discussions in Dublin around quiet ways. That's what they've been called, which have been proposed but haven't come through. There's been some interventions during the lockdown. Let's say there's permeability interventions. People from Dublin here would have heard about Grange Gorman, and there's another street in the south side of the city here, Pigeon House Road, and literally that's more or less it. But you can see the benefit in those interventions, even those kind of small limited interventions in Dublin, where these interventions are near schools and neighbourhoods, and you can see people, especially young children as well, so sort of maybe less confident or new, or just because of their age, they're more vulnerable. So more people are using these routes because of the reduction in traffic, because of the traffic calming effect. So yeah, I mean, you mentioned, Isabelle, that the LTNs are kind of controversial. Can you talk a little bit about that, just briefly, before we kind of get on to other?
Yes, absolutely. And just to answer Barbara's question in the chat, I'm not technical and techie enough to have made the map do what I wanted, which was to actually track my routes. But actually, no, the point is that I was cycling all the way into those areas which I circled up, and including some quiet ways, as we call them here, and some cycle superhighways, which were there, which have been created over the past sort of 7 years or so in London, and they're great infrastructure. But until the low traffic neighbourhoods appeared, I wasn't actually confident to reach those routes into central London, which were either through quiet ways, which were back routes, sort of quieter, or cycle superhighways, which are on main artery roads with protected infrastructure or not. But the point of the low traffic neighbourhoods is that right here where I live, where people live, you have in residential areas the confidence to cycle. It was all brought together around because of COVID, and it was about enabling more walking and cycling, given that public transport was pretty much out of bound for most people, unless they really had no other option. In order to stay safe, people needed to be walking and cycling more, otherwise they were in their cars and traffic was becoming an absolute nightmare. So to calm the streets in a kind of an emergency way. Temporary measures were brought in, big planters were put in the middle of the roads to stop entry points, well, keeping access obviously for emergency services and for refuse collections, so there was still the ability to get through on motorized transport, but restricted to only those. Some of them were buses and cycles and emergency vehicles only, and others were and with cameras to enforce it, etc. It is definitely controversial because people don't like change, and also some of the measures were put in without consulting local disabled people, and some disabled people found that those measures were really difficult for them, and some are challenging things in court as well. So definitely not some. I would say don't do it in quite as much of a rush as was done here, but it was in the unusual circumstances around COVID. But if we can take people with us and without making lives difficult for those for whom mobility is the hardest, i.e. disabled people, we need to consult properly, but it's well worth doing.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That's brilliant. So if without much further ado, we'll move on to our second panelist, if that's okay with everybody. So next up we have Owen Clifford. Dr. Owen Clifford is, as I said, a senior lecturer of civil engineering in NUI Galway and a 4-time paracycling world champion. And his presentation is "What has the bicycle ever done for me?" Excuse me. So over to you, Owen. Please fire ahead.
Thanks very much, Joan. So yeah, when I was asked to speak here today, for some reason the Monty Python "What have the Romans ever done for us" came to mind. So that's where I got the title of the presentation from. And just as you see in the picture there, it was my usual commute to work or commute home from work was with my then 2-year-old son in a trailer and my then 4-year-old daughter on the back of my bike, dropping them off to creche or whatever. Obviously, since COVID, that has changed a little bit. So yeah, my name is Owen Clifford, and I have I suppose a form of muscular dystrophy. Like all kids in Ireland, when I was young, I would have played almost all field sports, etc. And in my teens, I started noticing problems with running, twisting my ankles, spraining ankles, etc. And since then, I've had continuous degradation of muscle power in my lower legs and hands and lower arms as well. So it's a degenerative disease. And I suppose one of the ways it impacts me most in terms of my hands, my dexterity, etc., will be very poor. Zips and buttons and all sorts of things that people take for granted now I'm very bad with. But in terms of mobility, walking for me is very difficult. It's just painful. I can walk easily enough in terms of cardiovascularly. I can get, I'm not out of breath or anything, but it's just very painful. So I avoid walking. And when I do walk, I use splints or soft splints in my legs just to help me walk. So that's just a bit of background which might explain the following slides. So sorry, you can move on to the next slide. So what has the bike ever done for me? These are just 4 things I thought of very quickly. Freedom, family time, confidence, health and well-being. I'm going to start with the confidence one. When you're diagnosed with a muscle wasting condition when you're a teenager, I was a typical Irish teenager. I was pretty good at most sports, and that's very much part of who you are. It's a big blow, and I had to stop playing those sports pretty quickly because I was getting injured too often. But I always used to cycle anyway. I used to cycle in and out to school, and I'd often cycle to a match, play a match and cycle home from the match. Even when I was 14 or 15, I was doing maybe 50-kilometer cycle to a match, playing a match and cycling home. So bike has always been part of me. And in my later teens, after I suppose my confidence took a dent with having been diagnosed with my condition, I realized that I was actually very good on the bike and better than most able-bodied people who are racing even. And I found that I could race at a very high level against able-bodied athletes, but also obviously in Paralympic Games. So at that age, it was very important for me in kind of regaining a little bit of confidence in after being diagnosed. Freedom, well, for me, without the bike, I would have no freedom. The car cars give you a certain amount of freedom with a condition like mine. I can drive, but you end up having to park it and then walk somewhere, and that for me is always a problem. With the bike, I never have that problem, and it's really, it opens up so much for me, and I'll discuss a little bit about that later. In fact, this morning earlier on, I cycled 9 kilometers with my now 5-year-old daughter to her Polish lessons, because my wife is Polish, across Galway City, a gauntlet of a cycle, if I can say that. And before I did this talk here today, it gives family time, and that goes to what I mentioned there about my daughter, who you can see cycling on the road there. That was a previous Saturday on the way to Polish school. So every week on the way to school or home from school or on the way to this Polish school, I get, you know, quite a bit of time with her, talking, etc. And in, you know, these rushed lives, it's really that is a big thing. And also for me, it's important because I will never be able to run around with my kids very much, like many people probably, maybe who are on this call, and you know, won't be playing football very much, my kids, etc. So this is something that I can do with them. And also for me, with a muscle wasting condition, cycling is extremely important in helping to mitigate against that condition. Certainly it has done that. So you can move on to the next slide. So if I could choose one form of transport, only one, there would be no question, I would choose my bike. It's, for me, giving up a car would be very easy. We have a car, but to be honest, if we gave it up tomorrow, it wouldn't be a big problem. But if I had to give up my bike tomorrow, it would be life-changing for me. I use it for everything. And I think something that people don't think about it is that for me, for work, it's very important, because I work in a university, and the campus is quite big, and often you have meetings at various ends of the campus. And how else would I get around that campus? I certainly couldn't walk, and driving and finding parking on the campus would be very difficult, even with disabled spots. So the bike for me is vital. And when I go, a lot of my work is abroad, and when I go abroad to meet project colleagues, etc., there's often a dinner or lunch during the meetings. Often these occur in other buildings. All my colleagues walk over there. How else would I get there, except for what I do is every time I go abroad, I rent a bike or hire a bike to get me around. So it's very important for me. It opens up a city. Without a bike, I couldn't really be a tourist, because I'm not going to be walking around the city. I don't use a wheelchair. I suppose I potentially could, but I can get around with my 2 legs, but I don't use a wheelchair. So the bike for me enables me to be a tourist. As I mentioned, it enables me to run, play with my kids, etc. And as an engineer, I love the bike. It's the most efficient form of transport yet known on planet Earth. And I think it'll be hard for us to invent a more efficient form of transport. So from that point of view, as an engineer, I also love the bike. So you can move on. And I think maybe a lot of people on this call will be aware of this, but something I get a lot when I'm talking about cycling is that people are quite surprised that I might say that the car doesn't really allow me very much freedom. And, you know, surely for if you have a disability, that the car will be the primary form of transport. But no, I mean, for so many reasons, some of which I've discussed earlier on, any form of transport that allows someone with a disability to be active, in my opinion, is the most important form of transport, because the potential benefits to people, if you have a disability, potential benefits in terms of your quality of life, etc., when you can remain as active as is possible. Of course, that varies depending on your disability, is so important. And for me, the bike allows that. And certainly over the years, when I meet peers who don't cycle for various reasons, I suppose I've been lucky, it's always been part of what I do. The rate at which their muscle degeneration runs is much faster, or quite a bit faster than it would be for me. So it has really helped me improve or maintain my quality of life to the best extent possible. Also, cycling infrastructure is not just for cyclists, it is people who use mobility aids, it's for people who have wheelchairs, etc., etc. So I think the argument, you know, cycling infrastructure can have a very big positive impact on people with disabilities, even if they don't necessarily cycle. The next slide, please. And it's not just cycling lobbies who are saying this. Everyone from the United Nations will say this. The World Bank, which, you know, would be quite, I suppose one might say, a capitalist type organization, says this. The World Economic Forum says this. And just to put it in context, the global benefits of cycling, and this has been published by the European Cycling Federation, but the research was carried out not by them but independently, is about 150 billion euros per year, which is about the same that would require to solve the entire global sanitation problems. So this is what cycling gives us in terms of economic benefits. And clearly for urban areas, personal mobility is going to be a big part of the future. Cars, I think we all think will be much less important into the future. So just moving on to the next slide. Okay, so I couldn't let this talk go without a plea to my own local authority. I live in Galway on the west coast of Ireland, really a fantastic city. And I was recently doing a talk as part of an EU project, a research project in my speciality area of water engineering, which I'm leading. And as part of these projects, we typically get together with the project team, and this happened before COVID, and we normally ask everyone to present a slide on what they love about their city and a slide about what they hate about their city or the area that they live in. So my slide about what I hate about my city described how I get to work on my bike. And at the end of my talk, my colleagues in Belgium, there were a couple from Denmark, Netherlands and France, were in shock when they saw what I experience on the way to work in terms of infrastructure. So I appeal to our city council that unfortunately in Galway during COVID, there has been absolutely no cycling or pedestrian related, well, one small pedestrian related trials. I've lived in quite a number of cities, most recently in Wrocław in Poland, and unfortunately, including Irish cities, I just can't compare Galway to other cities in terms of how it debilitates mobility, personal mobility such as cycling, walking, but particularly for people with disabilities, it is extremely debilitating to try and get around Galway. And unfortunately, in many cases, despite, I'm just showing one example here, overwhelming public support for various schemes, the City Council has chosen not to go ahead with them. So I'm just hoping that there is huge changes here in Galway, and I think the City Council maybe would do well to join talks like these to see the types of positive benefits that better cycling infrastructure can make for everyone, but especially improving mobility for people with disabilities. So thanks very much for your time.
That's brilliant, Owen. Thank you so much. And thank you for getting in the mention about Galway as well. I know that that's a serious, even though as a Dub, I'm a bit far removed from it, but I know that there's serious problems really with the lack of infrastructure for walking and cycling, even during the lockdown and everything like that. So I might come back to you at the end and quiz you a little bit about that, and a little bit maybe about as well the kind of the issue of cars and cycling and the pros and cons of each as well. But thank you so much. That's really brilliant. We might then move on maybe to our next speaker, if that's okay, and we can come back to Q&As for Isabelle and Owen at the end of the presentations. So next we have Ellis Palmer, a news journalist and producer and hand cycler in the UK. So if you're happy to take over there, Ellis, feel free to work away.
Hi, Constatashi. Go on, my Hugger John. Ellis Palmer saying on. Right, where should we start? That's the Cooper Fucker. Right, where should I start? I guess start at the very beginning. You know, I'd never, well, I cycled as a child on a small trike, just as a way of getting around, as a leisure activity. And they had to take me out on the trike, to go to a local park or whatever. But much like Isabelle, as I got older and older, that was never really an option because of limited mobility, or my legs aren't working right, the trike was causing me pain, whatever. So it's something we gave up on, completely gave up on. And then I mainly, if I'm indoors now or if outdoors previously, I use an electric wheelchair as my main way of getting around because I live with cerebral palsy, which means my hand-eye coordination and my dexterity is absolutely pants, absolutely awful. So my main way of getting around would be an electric wheelchair. Problem with that is you come up against pavements and you come up against just really inaccessible public realm infrastructure. Be that pavements, be that a lack of drop down curbs, whatever it may be. 6 o'clock in the morning, and then home at night. And I see the cyclists on the road and I feel a pang of, man, I wish I could do that. I wish I wasn't disabled. A real dose of kind of internalized ableism going on in there. And when ironically, I used to live in Barcelona, and in Barcelona, I used to use my wheelchair a lot in the cycle lanes, but in London, you'd get a few funny looks if you did that. So I didn't really do that. And then I was on you're going to like this, the Greystones to Bray Cliff Walk in the County Wicklow with a friend of mine. And we're walking along and we're having a chat, blah, 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 blah. And we get to the end of the cliff walk, almost at Bray, 80% of the way there. And there's a massive flight of steps. And I'm like, oh crap, I'm not getting up that. And literally at the point where I encountered the flight of steps, we're talking about the greenways. And my friend used to live in Waterford, and he was saying, oh, Waterford Greenway. I was like, well, how am I going to do that in an electric chair that will only do 20 kilometres when it's a 42-kilometre greenway? That's not really going to be an option. And it'll take me all day because my electric wheelchair is quite slow. And at that point, we're turning around by the steps and going up, and because at that point my chair died. We're literally in the Greystones to Bray Cliff Walk, and my chair had died. So my mate has to push me away to the bus stop. And he says to me when I get to the bus stop, he says, have you ever thought about hand cycling? And I thought, no, what's that? Oh, that's not for people like me. That's not for people with nation and this awful dexterity. That's for people who are paraplegics. You know, it's not really an option. And I went away and I Googled it, and I came home and I Googled it and I did research, and I couldn't actually find anybody with cerebral palsy hand cycling. So not to be deterred by that, when I went in to get one of my other, I did some Googling and I found out that actually one of the primary hand cycle manufacturers in the UK is a bunch of guys called Da Vinci Mobility over in Liverpool, who've been making my usual electric wheelchairs, my main way getting around for 8 years. Sorry, for 15 years even, until 10. And they also turned out to be obviously one of the main hand cycle manufacturers. So I made a mental note of it, but when I go in there, I will mention my hand cycle. Because I went in, tried it out, blah, 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 blah. Actually, it worked. Beyond all belief, it worked. And beyond my father's doubts, my own doubts, Vince's doubts, is the guy who's actually the disabled man who runs the wheelchair making company. It worked. And we thought, oh God, I'm gonna have to try this now. So I thought, well, I spent my £3,000. I bought my hand cycle, saved up all this money, bought my hand cycle. I thought, you know, I'll give it a go, see how it goes. And honestly, I thought it was going to be a novelty. Now I think and that was literally the 16th of January, 2020. Never cycled really before my life. And then literally the hand cycle arrived on the 12th of March. And the lockdown in the UK came on the 16th of March. So can you imagine what a lucky time I had with that? And it became, obviously, my main kind of escape from the four walls was going out for cycling every day, was learning how things worked as a way of getting around, was learning how I want to be able to get from A to B to C. And my dad was great. He'd take me out on these cycles. We'd go, I learned about the infrastructure. And I'm never somebody who drives. It was never really an option. And also the expensive learning to drive would have been probably about €75,000, to put it in Irish terms, which I'm at, yes, there's grants available and things like that, but it was never really an option, especially for 3 of the last 4 years living down in London. You don't want to really drive in London anyway because it's traffic congested hellhole. But that was that. Sorry for the Londoners in this conversation, Isabelle. But I did it as my main way getting around, and you know, lockdown actually, the fact there was less traffic around on the road actually meant I could go on these busy roads and boost my confidence and learn it as a way of getting around. And that is what is really important, I think. Now, for me, I actually find, I don't know about the other disabled people in this call, but I actually find off-road routes really, really difficult. Why is that? That's because the infrastructure on off-road routes often includes things like chicanes and just, well, generally chicanes, to be honest with you, and uneven surfaces, which if I get stuck on an off-road route, it's got an uneven surface or a not very adept hill or something like that, and I fall off or I bash my wheel, that's job over, finito. So I actually, weirdly for a lot of disabled cyclists, I'm actually somebody who actually prefers to cycle on the road. It's because there's generally tends to be less barriers. Okay, cars are dangerous, but a reasonably big road and a hand cycle and cars can see me. But actually, if I'm on an off-road route, there's a lot more danger. I could trip and fall or something like that. So actually, on-road routes tend to work really well. But that being said, I think it is really, really important that there is segregated infrastructure there so that people can get from A to B to C safely. And let's say, for example, of this, I was in London this week, this last week actually, cycling around London, seeing if it would work. But I never thought I'd be able to cycle in London. And I was able to use literally the cycle superhighway that goes from the top of my, yes, kiss the gates goodbye parade, thank you very much. But there's a cycle superhighway that goes from the top of my road all the way to kind of London Bridge. I mean, another cycle superhighway that takes me from there to work, or kind of superhighway. And you know what? That's the kind of difference that segregated cycling infrastructure can make. It makes it easier to get from A to B to C. I must say, I didn't realise how much of a social cycler I was and how much I loved saying hi to people until I went down to London, where people tend not to talk to each other and you tend to get a lot of awkward stares. The other thing I noticed is, in terms of mobility and independence, is that a lot of people, particularly in London, big cities, stare at you but don't say anything. So they stare at you, but I just wish people would ask the question, how does that work? How does it help you getting around? How do you do this? How do you do that? Because I think disabled people have to move from being a kind of novelty in the community, oh, look at the disabled person, use them out of the way of getting around, to something that just is. And if people talk about how cycling and how hand cycles and how wheelchairs and how scooters can enable mobility and independence, then maybe that demystifies a lot of the barriers that people face in society. Because for a lot of disabled people, it's not necessarily their conditions that disable them, it's the lack of infrastructure, the attitudes, the lack of funding, but to enable opportunities for disabled people to be in employment, education, and training. Or to be honest with you, just fundamentally live, because that's an issue that one of the other issues for disabled people is housing, because housing is so bad, but oftentimes, you know, the only accessible property in some towns might be, I don't know, on the edge of town in like a sheltered accommodation location. So it's about making sure that actually, if you are putting in cycling infrastructure, be it segregated, be it not, it's about making sure you've got it in those areas where vulnerable populations are, so they can use it as a way of getting from A to B to C. And yeah, that's me. What next? Cycling a lot more in London, coming over to probably my favourite city in the world. Don't tell Barcelona or Liverpool, but Dublin. I really can't wait until lockdown and NEFIT and COVID and everything like that is eased and I'm able to come back over. What is next on the list? Obviously, Waterford Greenway, but also the new Greenway, the East-West Greenway from Dublin to Leitrim as well is on the list. 120 kilometres long. I have to go get my batteries charged, but that's what's on the list as a way of kind of enabling my mobility and independence. So happy cycling, guys. Thank you very much. Slán.
Slán. Thank you so much, Ellis. And Bula Bus more with the Cúpla Focal. That is super impressive. Gold stars. Sorry, everybody else. You've just been blown out of the water here. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. Yeah, I've just been like frantically taking some notes from all your presentations, guys, including yours, Ellis. There's just so much to discuss, but I don't want to take up Mary's time. So I might come back to some questions. And we'll see what the Q&A as well has to offer from our attendees. So thank you so much, Ellis. That's brilliant and really insightful, and just all of those kind of little, the small things that you encounter as well that people mightn't think about and that designers and cities mightn't think about, and some of the issues that you mentioned there, which are issues that I think Isabelle and Owen have also flagged around networking the infrastructure. It's not enough to have a cycle superhighway in the city centre somewhere miles away from where people actually live. So it's important to link up that infrastructure. So yeah, we can definitely come back to some of those topics too. So before I eat up all of Mary's time, Mary Caulfield, if you're happy to start your presentation, we'll hand over to you next. Is that okay?
Grand, thanks, Joan. Just
Brilliant.
starting my clock there so I know where I am.
Yeah.
I suppose I should start at the beginning. My disability it didn't kind of rear its head. It's something that came on quite gradually. Initially, actually, when I finished school, I trained as a professional dancer. So I have gone from being able to ask things of my body, and it complied without my having to think about it, and more than complied, you know, did quite extraordinary things. And I never had to think about the built environment. In fact, when I was growing up, I never used our garden gate because I would just leap over the wall and never even think twice of it. Now I will ask quite ordinary things of my body, and sometimes it'll just laugh at me. So what is my disability? It's made up of more than one thing, but I have a neurological disease. I have also orthopedic problems. And the orthopedic problems actually were what put an end to my dancing career. The neurological disease is actually chronic migraine with daily headache. And it was actually the migraine that brought me to using the bicycle as a mobility aid. So my way of managing my disability, my aids to managing my disability, I have an e-bike. I also use a rollator walker, one of those walkers that has the wheels on it. And I also have a service dog. His name is Scamp. He might make himself known, or he may be very good and not do that. And he's an alert dog. He will alert me to when episodes are starting, and that gives me a chance to get my medications in extra early, which makes them extra effective. So when I'm going somewhere, particularly once lockdown had started and I wanted to avoid public transport, just taking the bus and taking my rollator and Scamp on the bus was no longer an option. And so I decided to get a trailer to attach to my bike, because I found just using my bike, I ended up a little bit like, we have a myth, and I can't quite remember the name of the person in the Celtic myth, but he was up on a horse and he was either 100 years or several hundred years old. And then the strap and the girth of the horse gave way. He fell to the ground, and all of a sudden he was knackered, knackered with age. And that was the situation I was finding myself in, that I could cycle somewhere, but as soon as I dismounted from the bike, I was at a loss. And I was trying to figure out, how do I manage to have my rollator and my bike at the same time? And the answer was a trailer. And actually that's my bike and trailer and Scamp that you see in the poster for our meeting here today. I came across the idea for the e-bike from a weekend break that I had in Brussels. And there was something about being in a city where you weren't inundated with traffic, and just being in that atmosphere where you could have time away from the claustrophobia of motor traffic. That when I came back, for some reason, that experience, the penny dropped for me. I need a bit more help on my bike. One of my triggers when I was cycling was exercise is a trigger for my neurological disease. So if I was cycling into the wind or cycling up a hill, I was actually triggering an episode. And for me, episodes can last weeks and they're completely debilitating. And I came home, tried an e-bike, and it was like getting transported back to being 17 years of age again. All of a sudden, I was much more able, with that little bit of help from the e-bike. And so I have been using the e-bike as a mobility aid since. But it puts me in the position of, firstly, my disability isn't visible to people. I've got a hidden disability. And my mobility aid isn't recognised as a mobility aid in the same way as a wheelchair is recognised. So I'm flying under the radar to other people that I might need a little bit of consideration, a little bit of leeway, something that I think every cyclist would feel they don't get from the general motoring public. And so if on top of that, you are disabled, that can feel even more threatening. So really the need for, I'm going to call them mobility routes, because a cycle lane here in Dublin can be anything from the quality cycleway we have that runs along the Grand Canal, or painted strips on the road which have been likened to murder strips. And in fact, we've had cyclists have been killed while they're on these so-called cycle lanes. And we have the coastal mobility route out in Dunleary. So what those mobility routes offer is that confidence that the other panelists have alluded to. It can give you the confidence that when you get out onto the road, having the right kind of cycle that will work with your disability, and then having the coordinating infrastructure to enable you make that journey. That when those two things click, that's the confidence. That gives you the confidence to get out and try that. And I'm afraid that I've been quite disappointed in a lot of the narrative surrounding the implementation of these types of infrastructure that has so far pitted people with disabilities that use cars against people with disabilities that are largely invisible because they're using cycles of different kinds. And people shouldn't have to pit their disabilities against each other in order to have publicly provided infrastructure just so that you can go about your business and live your life. I don't like to see it getting used. We need infrastructure that is inclusive, that is for everybody, to enable people to go to school, get an education, go to work, live their lives, and be the healthiest and happiest and best functioning versions of themselves.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mary. Couldn't agree more with everything you said, but certainly that's such a great way to sum up, I think, what's needed, in my view, what's needed in Dublin and in most cities, that we have an exclusive, or sorry, not an exclusive public realm that's just for cars or just for people who are able-bodied, but we need an inclusive public realm, whether that's walking or cycling or wheeling, one way or another. And I totally agree as well with your point that there does seem to be quite a lot of, in some of the debates around whether or not we need to put in cycleways or expand pedestrian space or whatever the discussion might be, somewhere along the lines you will have somebody trying to pit disabled against cycling, or disabled people against this pedestrianisation scheme, or whatever it is that's being proposed. And I think that there's definitely valid points that need to be made there, but it seems to be kind of perhaps maybe not informed way of doing things, and also sometimes it might seem a little bit like using people just to stop a change being implemented. That's my own personal view, because I think that sometimes you know, you might have changes being proposed whereby you can actually still facilitate inclusion. So people who do need to use their car, and they don't have an option other than maybe using their car, and they do need to maintain a disabled or accessible parking spot at a proper suitable location. That's definitely something that's needed. But to use people against each other, or to use people against improving the city, I think that's something that's, I think, needs to be challenged. That's my own view. But I think
the equivalent of someone on a bus standing up to give someone else a seat on a bus that they can see has more need of the seat. We need people who don't need to make a car journey to make their journey in a different way, to give up that space to other people that have a greater need.
Yeah, that's a great comparison, I think. Yeah, absolutely. So I do think that sometimes you'll hear people talking about these questions, and they'll maybe say, oh, well, we can't put in this intervention because it'll impact, you know, people who are disabled who need to drive. And in my head, I kind of think, absolutely, I totally agree. You leave your car at home and allow people who need to drive, and everybody else who can use an alternative, they should be using the alternative. So no, that's really brilliant. And I think if we're kind of concluded with our panelist discussion, if we're happy to kind of go into the Q&A, we might take some questions from our attendees and our viewers here. Will I hand over to Siobhan? Are you monitoring the questions, or Mairead?
Yeah, there's a couple of questions. The first is from Mairead there in the chat. What's the experience of getting unusual bikes onto public transport in Ireland or in the UK?
Can I take that one?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you, Mary. Yeah.
Mentioned earlier was the monthly cycles. And I decided to go along to the inaugural meeting of the monthly cycles. But because where I live in Dublin, in Ringsend, there is no cycling provision, and I needed to get to the north side of the city where there is a decent bit of cycle route. I thought the handiest way to do that was to go by Dart. I would avoid that nasty part of the city centre, avoid the port traffic. So I cycled down to Lansdowne Road, took the bike onto the Dart, fine, got off at Clontarf. At no point along the route was I advised that Clontarf Dart station is up in the air. It's not on the ground. I got on at Lansdowne where the Dart station is on the ground. So I got off Sunday morning, the train pulled off, and I was left on the platform with no way of getting off the platform. And my first thought was, oh, well, okay, I'll just go home, until I realised I can't get to the platform on the other side to go home. I'm stuck. So I decided I'll contact Irish Rail. However, Irish Rail seemed to keep banking hours. And a Sunday morning, nobody was available. So I took to Twitter and put out a call for help if anybody had any ideas as to how I was going to get off this platform. The problem was the only way off the platform was either by stairs, which I couldn't take with a bike and a service dog, and the alternative was a lift. But when they built the lift, they built thinking the only people with disability that need this lift are wheelchair users. They weren't thinking of the bigger picture, the wider context of what it is to have a disability and the different types of mobility aids. So my bike didn't fit in the lift. But very luckily, someone from Monthly Cycles saw my plea for help, and the women came and rescued me. They were able to manage to get my bike up onto its hind wheel, stand it up in the lift and take it down, and then I was able to just walk onto the lift and go down. But that's just an example of one of the ways that you can get caught out because of the lack of provision and the lack of thinking of what it is to be disabled and what types of mobility aids people use then to manage their disability.
Yeah,
Hey, can I just echo that from Mary? That is one of the biggest barriers I've had here on Merseyside is, say I wanted to use the train to get from A to B to C, much similar to you guys have got the Dodge. I would have, there's like certain stations that I know have got bigger lifts that I'd feel comfortable using. But the problem is so many of the stations tend to have very, very small lifts, which makes it really okay if you're a wheelchair user, but even if you're using a bigger wheelchair, sometimes you're not able to get in that lifts. It makes it really difficult. So yeah, I completely echo that. There's bigger lifts, and then sometimes the problem is on if you're trying to use a bus to get from A to B to C. So then you can cycle for the next bit. Sometimes the buses tend not to have big enough spaces for a larger mobility aid, such as a hand cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I guess these are just more examples of the disabling infrastructure that causes problems for people who, and you know, in Ireland, and I think in the UK as well, there is this for public bodies, this idea of the public sector duty to you know, enable and include people, to make sure that there's equality for everybody, regardless of your ability, regardless of your background. And so there's still this, I think, mindset, and it may not be intentional, but it's not excusable, because it is it's like, as you said, Mary, it's like they didn't think to design the lift to be big enough. And, you know, in Ellis's case there, you were saying that it mightn't even be big enough to accommodate certain types of wheelchairs or certain types of other mobility aids, which is really, that's problematic. So the public bodies and the designers and the contractors, they need to be thinking about allowing everybody to be mobile and to bring whatever it is they need with them to be able to get around. I mean, the idea, and I remember, Mary, that instance of the Dart station in Clontarf, and it was appalling because you were instantly disabled by the circumstances, through no fault of your own, through no fault of anybody else. This was the building or the structure of the station that had now disabled you, and that was terrible. And I was glad that we were able to be there to help you, but I'm still kind of angry about it, that you had to rely on someone else to help you. You weren't able to independently just get off the train. It shouldn't be that hard. So yeah, this is definitely something that's a major problem, and hopefully change will be happening, and hopefully decision makers will make those changes to accommodate more and more people, and really ideally it should be everybody. Sorry, Isabelle, you have a raised hand there for a while, so I'll let you come on in while I stop ranting.
No, absolutely, it's a crucial problem, and I think, well, lots of thoughts, but one thought is absolutely needing to influence the standards and the design standards for public buildings, and so there's awareness. So Whilst Wellbeing has a guide for inclusive cycling, which you can all access on our website if you wish to. We're trying to put together useful information for all sorts of areas, you know, for campaigners, but also for professionals in the field, etc. But also it's a case of having, so growing the awareness of the fact that disabled people cycle, that cycles are mobility aids. I think the more you as a cycling campaign can do to generalize, to integrate this message within your messaging, as you are campaigning and raising awareness of cycling needs in general, then that would be a really good thing to just build into your main messaging, so it reaches many more people, and getting involved. So it's also for disabled people together to work better together. So organizations of disabled people becoming better aware of the fact that cycling is an area they should be conversant in, and bring on experts and people with experience within their organizations, so that as a disabled community, people are not fighting against each other, and building consensus around what safe and accessible cities and streets and roads are for all of us, and it's all equally valid and important. And then, as I say, as I started with, really getting into the places where you can influence, people can influence building standards, highway standards, etc. don't get reviewed every 5 minutes, but if you can become aware of where the next round of revision is planned for, whether it's government or local government, I don't know what the structures are, being at the table and having disabled people being at the table saying these are our needs around cycling infrastructure, road, highway infrastructure, public building infrastructure, housing infrastructure, parking infrastructure. All of these things need to have within them, not just when thinking about disabled people, not just the car and not just the wheelchair, but the whole realm of different mobility aids. It's quite complex, but they're all really equally important elements to get involved in.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the biggest things, sorry, just one of the biggest differences between Irish and UK legislation is the Equal Status Acts 2001, I think, and 2015 talk about the need to make reasonable accommodations. So it's about whatever the disabled person needs being an accommodation, kind of almost a private agreement, if you like. Whereas the UK legislation, at least in 3 of the 4 jurisdictions of the United Kingdom, talks about the need for reasonable adjustments. And how you define reasonable is very, very difficult. But the difference between adjustments and accommodation, the guys at the Independent Living Movement would say, is one of the biggest barriers that lots of disabled people face, because the notion of accommodation is coming through an agreement and the disabled person having to flag it up, whereas the notion of the notion of an adjustment is that it has to be made, if you know what I mean, rather than it being a private agreement.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, agreed. And I wasn't aware of that in the legislation in the UK, that's the wording or the concept. So yeah, that's a really interesting and important point, I think. And I'm not an expert in sort of the law around reasonable accommodation in Ireland. I don't know if the public sector duty sort of gives a stronger basis, sort of overruling the reasonable accommodation requirement or not. I would like to hope it does, but maybe that's something that has to be tested.
The reasonable accommodation requirement is primarily applicable to public sector organisations rather than private sector organisations in the Equal Status Act 2015.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so again, maybe that can form a part of our campaigning perhaps as well, just to really push that and push the concept of what is accommodation, as well as maybe, making more fundamental changes to the law. Owen, you have your hand up there. Sorry to keep you waiting.
No problem. Probably just to reiterate what Isabelle said, that so I should apologise first of all, because I'm a civil engineer by trade, and when I look around, I'm embarrassed, even though it's a fantastic profession and we do a lot of good things. But in this context, I'm embarrassed. But there's 2 things, I think. First of all, in the design and building standards, a lot of civil engineering now, unfortunately, relies on going by technical design standards, which are conceived by people that have no experience or no knowledge of how people might use, for example, bikes, or people might use wheelchairs, or people might use bikes with trailers. And I'm always reminded of the story around the development of the seatbelt and how it used the average 5'10" male in developing the seatbelt. And I often wondered about that, but now I understand how that is, because I interact with a lot of consultancies here, and they're so wedded to current design standards, even where they can see that I can show them that this makes no sense. So I think there's a big job of influencing design standards, but also the local authorities and transport agencies need to have engineers working in there who are disabled. Because, for example, I don't use a wheelchair. I have used one. I have a good idea how it might be like to get around in one, but I can't say for sure. I'm not. Whereas someone without my condition might wonder why am I not struggling with walking so much, and mightn't understand various issues that I have. So I think you need to have professionals with disabilities. And there's just one other question, and I hope, if it's okay, just that I might address this, because I actually have to do that school run in the other direction for my daughter. But it was actually about blind pedestrians and cyclists do not safely mix, and does the panel agree? I think it depends on the context, but just this morning, when I was actually cycling through the town across, there was a lady who walked off the pavement in front of me. Now she was using a stick, so I could see from quite a bit off that she might be visually impaired to some extent, and but she walked in front of me, and I anticipated it and expected it, and I was fine. So my point being that I think it depends on the context, but in these types of contexts, the cyclist does, I suppose we always look at the triangle of mobility, and pedestrians come, at the top of that triangle, because that is the most accessible form for most people, I know not for everyone, but the vast majority of people that is. And I think if as cyclists, you do have to be aware of that might happen. But on the other hand, the infrastructure should be designed in such a way to limit the numbers of times that things like that might happen. So I think I don't think I don't think that they cannot safely mix. I don't really agree with that. I think they can if it's thought about and designed for, and if cyclists are aware. So anyway, yeah, I just said I'd address that if that's okay.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Thank you, Owen. I was going to actually bring up that question as well, because I think the person who asked it has been waiting for a moment to have that. And I totally agree, absolutely, from my own perspective about both those points that you make, Owen, about the design needs to be implemented on the part of local authorities and the various authorities to minimize conflict and interaction. So to keep walkers and cycling people separate and safe insofar as possible. And then there's the individual responsibility of people cycling to recognize that hierarchy of road users, that pedestrians come first, cycling comes second, and then basically everybody else is after that. And then within the pedestrian kind of world, you would have the most vulnerable are at the very, very top of that peak. So you'd have people with disabilities, if it's visibly obvious, young people, maybe older people, and so on. So absolutely, that's how I would be interpreting that as well. And I completely agree. I don't know if any of the other panelists might have views on that. That's the point around people who are blind or visually impaired and cycling, that the two just don't mix. Yeah, Mary, go on ahead. Yeah.
I think that some of the scary reaction, and I can only say this as someone whose sight is more or less okay when I have my glasses on, comes from a car-centric view that if suddenly a pedestrian is somewhere where they shouldn't be, what it's like to react from behind the wheel of a car. But when you're in the saddle of a bike, the reaction and the maneuverability, the interaction between the person on the bike and the pedestrian is very different to the interaction if you're inside a car and you're trying to communicate with somebody outside the car. All of that is vastly improved on a bicycle, to the extent that when I was rearing my daughter, and she was a little kid, and I said, if you're ever crossing the road and there's a conflict with you and a cyclist, look straight at the cyclist and cover your eyes and let the cyclist know, I am giving all my power to you. Now it's up to you to avoid me. Because one of the hardest things for a cyclist to perceive is, if the pedestrian goes into that dance, I'm stepping this way, no, I'm stepping that way, and the cyclist doesn't know which way to get around you, compared to if you make yourself an immovable object, a cyclist is going to get around you without there being a collision. Having said that, of course, with all modes of transport, you're going to get rogue people or people who just don't care, and there will be collisions. Personally, I would prefer not to have any collisions, but if I am going to have a collision, I would rather have a collision with a cyclist than with a motorist. And that's my perspective on it. Open to correction from anybody who has a disability that involves their sight.
Great, thanks very much, Mary. Isabelle, you have your hand up, I think, there as well.
Sorry.
Yes, again, like as I mentioned earlier, I think it's really important that we start getting talking to each other within disability groups, and that we find a consensus. And I have learned a lot. I'm not visually impaired. I've learned a lot from listening to people with visual impairment, and our infrastructure needs are very different. And actually, as a wheelchair user, I hate the tactile paving, but I understand why it's there, and it needs to be there for people with visual impairments. In terms of cycling and cyclists and people with visual impairment, I agree that, and I think it's in general with all pedestrians, that we should aim to have different and separated and protected infrastructure between pedestrians and people on wheels who want to go faster. So we can go faster if there are no pedestrians in the way, and pedestrians can go safer if there are no cyclists or wheelchair users or mobility scooter users in their way. And the more we develop safe, protected mobility infrastructure, as Mary called it, and I call it too, mobility lanes rather than cycle lanes, the more we have good infrastructure for people on wheels wanting to go further and faster at a faster pace than a pedestrian pace, and the more people who are on the pavement can feel safe and protected. Now, again, the rogue pedestrians and all cyclists will be in the way of everybody, and we can't necessarily do very much about that. But the more we provide for safe wheeling and cycling infrastructures on the carriageway rather than on the pavement, the better it is for everybody. And I think we need to get to a point where disability groups and cycling groups need to work together for generalized safe infrastructure on the carriageway. There will be occasional places where this is not possible, and in that case the cyclists have to go as slowly as possible, and all those who can walk their cycle, etc., for tiny little places, and that might be justifiable very rarely, but generally I think we need to be separated from each other, both being safe and work together.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Isabelle.
I would always have pedestrians and cyclists segregated, just because, as a disabled cyclist, sometimes if I'm trying to dodge out the way of pedestrian, it can cause my coordination to go all skew with and make things really difficult. But also, it's about trying to think about the public realm differently. If you think about the public realm differently, then you're going to get a more inclusive public realm. But the problem is, shared spaces come about when people just think about roads and pavements. They don't think about roads, mobility lanes, and pavements. So you have to think about the public realm in a slightly different way, that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So just, we have, I think, a couple of more questions coming in. One is from, I believe, Robbie, and Gladys also has a question. So I might hand over to Siobhan just to take those two, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'll just say thanks to Robbie for waiting. We could see your hand up, so I'm going to allow you to talk now, so you should be able to ask your question.
I can see Robbie, and Robbie, you're on mute. If you can switch off your mute.
Hello, yeah. How are you?
Hi.
This is Robbie here. Because I am the person who asked the question, I'm very sorry. I didn't know which was working, and it took me a while to unmute because I am blind and I'm using voiceover on the phone here.
Sure.
And I think it's great to hear the stories how enabling that cycling has been to people with physical disabilities. And that is fantastic. But from a sensory disabled perspective, from a person with a severe visual impairment, blind, I have been knocked down by 5 times in the last 10 years by cyclists on the pavement. Well, actually once crossing at a green light with the bleeper. Now, good planning means that pedestrians have to be always separated from cyclists, because I am not a rogue pedestrian if I accidentally walk in front of a bicycle. That is down to complete and utter separation. And also, if I need to cross a cycle lane in order to get to a bus stop, like that's dangerous. That's reckless planning. So I think that cyclists have to dismount where they come into pedestrian zones is the only way for safe. And it's not just blind people, but people over 85 or 80. They're equally part of our community, and they need to be taught about as well. And also, if I need to get to a doctor's surgery or anywhere that I need to get a taxi to, I don't love cars. I'm not an automobile expert or anything like that. But I need to do that for independence. The taxi driver will not leave me may leave me at the end of a large pedestrianised area, and I am completely lost.
Yeah, absolutely.
Robbie, can I just ask, when it comes to you talking about dismounting, somebody who's a hand cycle, I cannot dismount my hand cycle cycle and push my wheelchair to the end of a pedestrian dismount thing. So what I end up doing is I end up turning off any power assist I've got on my hand cycle and just going at it as manually as possible. So sometimes dismounting signs and things like that can be ableist against people who have physical disabilities, but stop them, from being able to dismount.
Yes, completely. I agree. I can see where you're coming from. But ultimately, what happens is rights to safe access to one's environment trumps everything else. So trumps a lifestyle choice. So yes, I believe that you need safe access on your bicycle to wherever you can, but not at the disempowerment and the endangerment of pedestrians. So ultimately, the right of blind people, there are 55,000 in Ireland, right of us to safely access our environment is a human right, unlike the rights of cyclists. And ultimately, it will be fought in the courts if there are conflicts.
Thank you, Robbie. Yeah, and I completely agree on the point of the human rights aspect. Like, everybody has a fundamental human right to access the public realm safely. There shouldn't be hazards. I'm not sure if the others may agree that where you're using a pedal cycle or a hand cycle or something as a mobility aid, there's less of a choice maybe in the matter there, but I'm not in a position to say. But I think, Mary, you were holding up your hand. Did you want to respond? You're on mute there at the moment.
Just to say that we have wandered into the area of competing rights. And I think that's where we need to raise our game with the designers and the engineers, so that these spaces that are contentious are limited, and we have the very minimal amount of spaces that are like that we look to other cities and other jurisdictions. What is the best practice? And finally, to say that there isn't a category of people called cyclists. Nobody is born in a maternity hospital and the doctor lifts up the infant and said, "Oh, you've had a little cyclist." We are people who make decisions about how to get from A to B. And what we are trying to do is improve those decisions. In particular, people that have choices make better choices, make more informed choices, make less selfish choices. And I think when we put all of those things together like a jigsaw puzzle, then when we get to that best possible place and we still have some contention, then we have to look at the disabilities and see who has the ability to give way a little bit here to someone else who can who can stand up for a little bit and give that seat on the bus to someone else, even momentarily. And I think that really just comes down to our humanity then, be the decent skin.
Yeah, and I think kind of, I don't know if it's simply a result of the design of the cities that we're in, but it's very disheartening and just, it's dismaying that people are pitted against each other, from different disabilities and so on. And Robbie, I'm conscious that we're all sighted on this call. You're the only guy representing visually impaired or blind people. So I'm conscious that we don't want to sort of have one particular viewpoint here. So thank you for.
We're not. Sorry, I represent Voice of Vision Impairment, which is DPO, Disabled Persons Organisation, under the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. So I am not just speaking. I'm speaking. This is our organisation, like the UK Federation of the Blind, is exactly the same position. We are a DPO. This is not an individual. We're tired of being knocked down by bikes, and there is a difference between rights and choices. And ultimately, our right to safely access our environment cannot be taken away from us by anybody.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I totally agree with that. I see over here, Ellen, you have your hand up as well. Do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I just have a couple of things to say. As someone with a degenerative lung condition, I don't perceive cycling, and this is pretty upset me actually. I don't perceive cycling as a lifestyle choice. I perceive it as a health choice is a life prolonging choice. I need to exercise and maintain my fitness in order to prolong my life. So for someone to call it a lifestyle choice is upsetting, because for people here, it's not just a choice, it's a necessity. So I've been quite upset by that. But I do, of course, agree that we need to look after everybody and keep everyone safe. But in countries where you have mobility and cycling infrastructure, you have more women and children cycling, and the speed of cycling actually comes down. So I think one of the reasons people are getting knocked down on pavements and at pedestrian crossings, which is appalling, is because the only people who are really cycling in Dublin now are young men who have a profile for being risk takers. As you increase the mobility lanes, as you increase the width mobility lanes, cycling actually becomes safer. Cycling slows down. You get wheelchairs on cycling lanes. You get families on cycle lanes. You also get that behavior being frowned upon and basically social pressure stopping it. So it's actually the case that, and Denmark and the Netherlands have shown this, as you increase cycling and mobility lanes, people become safer. Pedestrians are actually better catered for these things. So it's not a matter of we have to stop cyclists because they will knock people down. It's we have to make the rogues the exception rather than it being acceptable. So that's all I wanted to say.
So yeah, I'm cited as an example, and I'm sorry, I don't. It's cited an example of great and Denmark as well, but it's never done so from a disability perspective. So TfL studies into this bus, through cycleways and the bus island stops, etc. in London, shows that cyclists they do not change their behaviour, generally speaking, when it comes to pedestrians crossing these zones. So this is just research. The Holmes report in 2015, similar with the Trinity House report in Ireland 2011. Okay, now in terms of us being pitted, I think we would object to that. Like, that's taking away our agency. We are the experts as disabled people in what we know what our needs are as disabled people, and we know from our members, we know that being knocked down by a cyclist is very upsetting. And we absolutely have a right to safe access to services and to our environment, to be equal part of the community, and not at anybody else's expense. So somebody else, ultimately, we do not have a choice. We do have to walk to the shop unless we get somebody to do it for us. This is all about our independence, and we do not have a choice.
Thanks very much, Robbie. We have another question from our attendee, Gladys. So I think, Ellis, you had your hand up. Would you be able to just be very quick in your point and we can move on to Gladys? You're still on mute there. Do you want to unmute? Thank you.
Robbie, I was just going to say, I was cycling in London on the cycle superhighways the other day, and all the points where there are bus stops, there is tactile paving, and there are also things on the cycle lanes warning cyclists to go slow. The problem is the vast majority of cyclists using the routes, especially in the daytime, tend to be white, middle-aged or middle-ish aged men, right? Who tend to ignore these things and just go cycling past. And I was cycling along, and you know what? It so annoyed me to see cyclists just completely ignoring these things, and that is a real problem. But I do take a bit of offence at you saying my cycling is a lifestyle choice, because I cannot dismount my hand cycle and manually propel for a cyclist dismount area. I have to do it. So it's not a lifestyle choice, it's a necessity as a way of getting around.
Well, then we need to be separated completely. So, because I do not want to be run down by anybody if they're in a wheelchair or if they're in anything. I'm speaking for our members here, because this is our policy. Like, we have a right to safely access our environment. So it just comes down to that. And also, as far as Keane's point about TfL, the 2017 report actually does point out that there are problems, and it recommends that cyclists be educated to get around that problem of cyclists ignoring blind people and other disabled people crossing to island bus stops. So that report is there. So the research is there, but it's straightforward. It doesn't take a genius to know that a blind person and a cyclist doesn't make. There was an unfortunate cyclist killed in the Phoenix Park in December 2017 because a pedestrian stepped out in front of him. There's no point in blaming the pedestrians. They're top of the hierarchy. You have to plan for total segregation.
Thanks very much, Robbie. I think, Siobhan, if we can move on to Gladys's question as well. I know she's been waiting a little while.
Yeah, thanks, Gladys. You put this into the chat earlier. I'll just read out the question. I'd love to be able to cycle to get me out as a disabled woman. Are there grants, etc., available, as they are expensive? Not sure who might tackle that question.
I don't know if we have maybe some of the UK experience.
My problem, go on. I was going to say my problem is I don't know specifically about the Irish context, but I would imagine potentially for the disability benefit. But over here in the UK, we have access to work. If you are a disabled person in work, that is an option as a way of getting around. But also we do have, I think what is needed is better grant making facilities, be that through DPOs or be that through charities, as a way of encouraging people to use it as a way of getting around. The big thing I would say, Gladys, though, is to try before you buy. So see if there is an inclusive cycling network in your local area. I know over here in England, there is, in the northwest of England where I am, there's a group called Wheels for All, and they hold inclusive cycling sessions in parks in towns and cities across the country. Now, there's the Wheels for Wellbeing in London as well. But the big thing I would always say is try before you buy, because it's an expensive decision, but try to make sure and see what works for you wherever possible.
Great. Thank you very much, Ellis. I don't know. I know that I don't know if anybody has experience here in the Irish context on purchasing. Yeah, Mary, you have your hand up.
I don't know what the policy is, but from a social welfare perspective, the catch-all within the social welfare system is the community welfare officer. I've not gone that route myself. I have found myself to be at the forefront of trying things or doing things, and the system is not there yet. But the community welfare officer may be someone that you should actually just check in with and see. The problem may be that the bike is not recognised as a mobility aid, and maybe some work needs to be done there with our politicians to have it recognised.
Yeah, I do think there's probably a significant gap there. And I mean, I know that we might have a contribution coming in to us in just a moment around grants and accessibility. But at the moment, as far as I'm aware, there's a scheme like the Bike to Work scheme, but the only people that benefits are people in full-time, I think it is full-time work, and the cost of some of the maybe adapted or non-standard, let's call it, pedal cycles, the cost of those is way above the Bike to Work scheme amounts, and so it can still remain prohibitive for people. I think we have Maho Rivas from Cork, the real capital of Ireland, who is here to give us some tips on that side of things. Maho, go on ahead there.
Thanks, Emil. So, because of my professional experience, I do give people information on their rights and entitlements. Unfortunately, there isn't any kind of like one specific grant for it, aside from, the people who are working, as you said. But like Susan was saying, the community welfare officer can administer what it's called the exceptional needs payment. It's called ENP, and you can look that up on Citizens Information. And that is a payment that is a catch-all payment, basically for things that are essential once-off necessities that cannot be met from someone's weekly income. It is a means-tested payment, so they do ask for information on someone's savings, etc. But it's something that I do think we can and should probably explore to use a bit more in that regard. As I said, it would be ideal that we did have, and I think a lot of us are asking for more inclusive supports for people for everyone really, and not just employees, PAYE employees to access bikes. But that's definitely something to explore. And I would say if you need any help in terms of putting a good case for an ENP, contact your local Citizens Information, and they might be able to help. And just as a second thing, I guess I just wanted to maybe speak on something that's a bit structural about the issue about people cycling on footpads. I think when we look at, we have to look at the bigger picture as well in terms of some things that are incentivizing, unfortunately, cycling on footpads, such as, the policies of private delivery companies. For example, Deliveroo, we've seen some really shocking practices in terms of how people are paid. So there is a perverse, incentive there to go faster, and sometimes people take the fastest route, and that's not respectful of other people, especially pedestrians and people with sight impairments. And also just looking as well as how, I guess in Cork City, I'll say there's so many streets that are only one way that if they were two way, they would remove an awful lot of that really problematic cycling on footpaths, because the only other alternative sometimes is cycling around 2 kilometers and exposing yourself to the quays that are really dangerous in terms of left hooks. So there are really big infrastructure and structural issues as well to address. Thanks, Mo.
Thank you very much, Maho. Yeah, I would agree with that as well. I've suspected anyway on my part that sometimes when you see people cycling on the footpaths, in my view, it's just never excusable. If you can dismount, you should be walking your bike if you're afraid to cycle on the footpath. But I absolutely agree that there's a corollary as well. Some people will cycle on the footpaths because they're afraid. To me, it doesn't justify what they're doing, but they're afraid because the road is too dangerous, maybe. So I think there's definitely an issue around that. I totally agree, Maho, on that if there's improvements perhaps on the roadway and the mobility routes that are being built, then that will hopefully encourage people to actually just use those routes that are there available for them and reduce that conflict and the danger that is posed, because it isn't excusable. I've been nearly hit several times as well by people cycling on the footpaths, including sort of post serious injury when I kind of had my own impairments at the time, and it was pretty terrifying, and it's terrifying the rest of the time as well. So it's not acceptable. But yeah, there's definitely other wider issues that need to be addressed, I think, that are connected or linked to that as well. Siobhan, do we have any other questions coming in? Do we know? Or
I think we've covered everyone. I know we're quite over time now, so it is probably time to finish up. There was questions about parking earlier, but various people covered those in what they said. So I think we can wrap up.
Yeah, there might be one question just to come in from Kieran. Is that right? Kieran, did you have your hand up?
Thanks. Yeah, well, just to say thanks to the panelists really for their contributions. And just to get a word in for the non-disabled white male population, we're terribly underrepresented usually. So I've taken a 2 ears, 1 mouth approach to this, and it's been really insightful. But I suppose something that sticks with me, I think it was Sinead Burke, the activist who spoke about this before, but how she spoke about people often presume her disability or presume her needs and intervene without probably asking her. And she said that one of the best things people can do is to ask her the question, how can I help you? And I suppose as a cycling advocate, that would be my question as well to our panelists. And I suppose to ask, is that the right question? Is that the thing to keep in mind at all times, and to ensure that we're keeping the channels of communication open, but that we're also asking the right questions?
Absolutely, yeah. Do any of our panelists want to respond to that? About asking the right questions, is it appropriate to be asked, how can I help you? And if it is, what's the next question? Ellis, yeah.
Don't always assume it's about asking. Don't always assume the person wants help just because they exist. Just for Christ's sake, talk to the person like a normal person. Don't talk to the person specifically about their disability or whatever. Just talk to the person, treat the person like a normal person. And don't assume that just because they're on a non-standard cycle, they actually need help or they need assistance. If you've got a question to ask them about the bike or whatever, then just really ask them about their bike. Don't make it about assistance.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No apology needed. Absolutely well said. Isabelle, you have your hand up there, yeah?
Yeah, just as a cycling advocacy organisation, I think it's about as I think I mentioned earlier, listening as you have been doing today, which has been brilliant. Thank you for having us, and integrating some of our asks into your mainstream ask, into your day-to-day asks, so that you can grow the awareness. You've grown your awareness, and that's fantastic, and then you grow the awareness of the people you usually engage with out there, the public sector, the politicians, etc. It is very much about taking it out of the. I mean, I always say that you know, if like in any other area of life, if we start looking at inclusive design, providing infrastructure, services, facilities, products inclusively when looking at cycling, then we've provided for everybody else. And there's a big area somebody mentioned, I think in regard to parking, I can't remember, about cargo cycling. And if we can, I mean, we have I realized a few years back, talking at an event a bit like this, just in real life, in pre-COVID, where there were people, you know, advocates for family cycling, cycling with little children, cargo cycling, or using trailers, etc. That we have 90% of the same issues. So disability and cycling is not a minority issue. If you look at it, if you listen to the asks of disabled people who may have the cherry on the cake as far as barriers are concerned, so it isn't actually often about choice, it's about necessity, it's about the mobility of being able to get about, but also adding us to the voice of parents who cycle, and to the voice of people who want to carry things by cycle, rather, so cycle logistics. So cargo cycling and disabled cycling are very much, you know, have in the majority of the same issues: parking, the width of price, affordability, cycle parking, cycle storage, cycling infrastructure, not being able to cope with stairs, needing wide enough lifts, etc., etc. And suddenly it's not a minority issue. It isn't about, oh, well, how many disabled people have you seen cycling about? Well, you probably have seen many, but you haven't noticed them, because a lot of them would have been on two wheels, just like Mary, but that doesn't make them not disabled. But also, it's, you know, actually, if we can solve by thinking inclusive design, we can solve the problem of the school run, which I'm assuming is the same in Ireland as it is in the UK and everywhere else. This fun, you know, the school run traffic could be solved in large part, and last mile delivery, logistics, that can be solved by the same token. So think, advocate for inclusive design for cycling, and make allies, as you probably already have, with the logistics organisations and small businesses, and parents and cycling, and disabled people who cycle. But if you learn from our point of view, that, you know, we've really sharpened the narrative around the needs, the barriers, and what needs to be removed. But if you, having learned from our extreme perspective, you've actually covered the needs of a huge number of people who could be cycling more, who could be decluttering and decongesting and depolluting the streets. and that should help politicians understand that actually that is the right angle to start looking at it from, to really radically change the environment that everybody's living in.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Isabelle. Yeah, and I think that's a really important note or theme to maybe to wrap up on, because I think the idea of oh yeah, we'll come over to Mary in just a moment, but the idea of applying universal design principles, that simply means everyone can use the building, the road, whatever it is that's being designed, and you're not excluding then, you know, a huge sector of the population from whatever activity they wish to engage in. So absolutely, I completely would 100% support that. And then somehow, whether it's through advocacy or other means, incorporate the voices as well of people with disabilities and disabled people into those discussions. So at the table with the designers or during the consultation phases of designing whatever the project might be, that is not lost, as I think Owen mentioned earlier, that you have engineers who think they're doing the right thing by sticking to the standards document, but the standard document itself is the flawed document. So I think we need to maybe try to influence and shape improvements at that stage as well. Mary, will I give the last word to you, if that's okay?
Sure. Just
No
on that note, just a little bit of more hopeful news. Once people dismount from their bikes, the next step is where you're going to park them. And if you have a non-traditional cycle, then the bike parking you need is different to the norm. And we haven't begun to roll that out just yet, but DCC Beta, that arm of Dublin City Council that trials different policies to see how they work, is about to trial cycle hubs, I think they're called, those on street bike parking with the kind of hood thing that goes over and keeps the bikes safe. They're about to trial some of those for non-traditional bikes. So the space inside will be laid out for different types of cycles. So
brilliant. That is good news. Yeah, absolutely. I think I've seen those. They're like bike bunkers or bike hangers.
Yeah.
They're lockable. Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, that's brilliant. So maybe that's an indication that hopefully some change is getting in there into the workings of the yeah, incremental change, but change nonetheless, hopefully. And maybe it is a sign that the message is getting through to the hallowed turf of the local authority, and then maybe we'll see that roll through, and so that the city can be shaped for all, so that it's not exclusive anymore, that it's an inclusive city. So hopefully we'll see that before too long. So on that note, on that hopeful note, I think I'll wrap up. So I want to say again, thank you so much to Ellis, to Mary, to Isabelle, and to Owen, who had to leave us a little earlier on. Thank you so much for your presentations, for giving the time of your Saturday on. It's lovely weather here in Ireland, so I don't know what it's like over the UK, but you've sacrificed a good chunk of your afternoon. So thank you so much for that, and for sharing your knowledge and your expertise. It's been really brilliant to hear, and to hear the discussion afterwards as well. And thank you so much as well to everyone who came in with questions, including Robbie, Maho and Gladys with your questions, and everyone else who's been chipping in the chat box and the Q&A. I really appreciate that. So if that's okay, Siobhan, you're in control in the hot seat. I'll let you close down the session, but thank you so much to everybody for taking your time, and hopefully we'll be able to follow up in due course with the Dublin Cycling Campaign, and to progress things around inclusion and universal design in the city, hopefully.